Let's understand what's so special about caching dynamic content and why the Cache API, which we use thus far, might not be the best choice. To begin with that, I want to clarify something else though. What's the difference between dynamic caching and caching dynamic content? Both terms have caching and dynamic in the name. Well, let's have a look. They are not the same. Dynamic caching is what we did thus far, and it's not a single pattern or something like this. Dynamic caching simply means if we have our page and we send a network request, which is intercepted by the service worker, therefore the service worker reaches out to the network, and we then get this back and store this in the cache and return it to the page, like in our cache then network strategy. We make sure that we store assets, resources, the user requests in the cache once we got them. We use that not only in the cache then network strategy, but in other strategies too. Basically, dynamic caching always happens whenever you not just pre-cache files during the installation, but you add files, resources to the cache once you got a response during a fetch request. This is dynamic caching. It just means you dynamically add items to your cache. That's all. Now, caching dynamic content means something else. Actually, the pattern isn't that different. We still have a page and we send a network request which gets intercepted by the service worker, but we don't use the Cache API. Instead, we use a new tool, IndexedDB, which is an in-browser database, a key value database. It runs in the browser and it's there to help you store, well, data, as all databases do, I guess. The difference to the Cache API is that IndexedDB is used differently and that it's not so much about storing CSS or script files or images in there, but instead storing JSON data, XML data. So basically the structured or unstructured data you're getting back from your backend. Not files, not assets which define how your application works or looks, but the meat of your application, the content. So in the end, we still reach out to that to get the data from there, at least if we have a cache then network strategy. And we also reach out to the network, return it to the page via the service worker, of course, and also store it in the IndexedDB. So basically this still is a cache then network strategy, just that our cache is no longer the application cache we used with the Cache API, but instead IndexedDB. The question then of course still is, why would we use that? So first of all, we have to recognize that we're talking about data that changes frequently and therefore is dynamic. That is what's meant with dynamic content. And it typically is in JSON format or XML format, but JSON is the most common choice nowadays. And for that, the IndexedDB just happens to be really good because it's a key value database. We can store JSON data there and we have more power over it than we have with the normal Cache API. There we can just store the response and we have to parse the response whenever we use it. It's the whole HTTP response. In IndexedDB, we can already store the formatted response or whatever we want. We can store pieces of the response. We have the full power over what we want to store, which part of the response we want to store. Now, that doesn't make much sense for CSS files because there we typically want to store the complete response because we just want to serve that to our page in the end. But for data, JSON data, dynamic data, we might want to pick certain fields we want to store. Maybe we want to transform it. Think about the transformation we're already doing in our project with that data from Firebase. That's why IndexedDB is a great choice for dynamic content, typically in the JSON format. We can transform it, we have more control over it. The Cache API is possible to be used and it's not necessarily wrong or bad, but you can definitely use IndexedDB for that and it might hold some significant advantages. So that's the key thing. The approach is the same, cache then network. But the data nature and format is different, and therefore we might want to store it differently. Of course, we can use IndexedDB not only with the cache then network approach. You can basically use it whenever you use the Cache API, just for JSON data, typically not so much for CSS file, JavaScript files. But if you have JSON data, feel free to use any of the strategies you learned about in the last modules and replace the cache with IndexedDB for JSON data. Now let's learn more about IndexedDB and let's then use it in our project.